Welcome to Copilot Podcasts. There is a government running behind every nation on earth that no elected official answers to, no journalist covers, and no satellite can photograph. And the Bible describes it in detail. Most people who read scripture every single week have no idea it's there. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the biblical unseen realm. Specifically, you're going to understand what the divine council actually is, why God assigned spiritual beings to govern the nations, and how three specific biblical passages, Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 82, and Daniel 10, map out a cosmic structure that changes how you read pretty much everything else in the Bible. My co-host has gone deep on this, and I want to start with what feels like the most disorienting question possible. So, walk me in.
So the place to start is with a term that Hebrew and Semitic scholars actually use, the divine council. It refers to the heavenly host, the pantheon of divine beings who, according to the biblical text, administer the affairs of the cosmos. And the scholar most associated with bringing this into popular conversation is Dr. Michael Heiser, who earned his PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and spent years as scholar-in-residence at Logos Bible Software.
And he wrote The Unseen Realm, right? That book has been everywhere.
Yeah, published originally in 2015, and it just got an expanded edition in October 2025 to mark its 10th anniversary. Over 175,000 copies sold. The tagline is literally, if it's weird, it's important. And the core argument is that the biblical authors were not operating within a strictly material or purely monotheistic framework the way modern readers assume. They described a reality filled with spiritual beings, divine hierarchies, and cosmic conflict.
Okay, but when you say divine beings and hierarchies, I mean, that sounds like it could slide into polytheism pretty fast. How is this different from just saying the Bible has multiple gods?
That is exactly the right tension to name, and it's actually the center of a real scholarly debate. But here's the distinction the text itself draws. The divine council worldview says Yahweh presides over a council of lesser divine beings. They are subordinate, created, and accountable to him. It's not a pantheon of equals. It's more like a cosmic administration.
So less Greek mythology, more, a celestial bureaucracy?
That's actually a pretty accurate way to put it. And the anchor text for all of this is Deuteronomy 32, Y's 8, 9. It reads, and this is the NIV, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance.
Okay, so sons of God, that phrase is doing a lot of work there.
It really is. And here's what's fascinating about the translation history. The Greek Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, actually renders sons of God as angels of God in that passage. So the ancient translators understood these beings as angelic figures assigned to govern the nations. This wasn't a fringe reading, it was the common understanding.
Wait, so this was just common knowledge? Like the original readers didn't need a footnote for this?
Exactly. According to the research at Verses vs. Vanity, the biblical authors didn't explain this because their original audience already knew it. Moses, in the Song of Moses, was telling people to ask their elders about it, as if it were basic background information. We're the ones who lost the thread because we're reading it thousands of years later with a completely different set of assumptions.
That's kind of a humbling reframe. Like, we think we're the sophisticated readers, and actually we're the ones missing the obvious.
Right. And the event that triggers this whole arrangement, the assignment of nations to divine beings, is the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. Humanity rebels, God scatters them, divides them into nations, and according to Deuteronomy 32, assigns those nations to be governed by lesser divine beings. Israel, though, is kept as God's own direct portion. That's the setup.
So Babel isn't just a story about language, it's the origin point of this whole cosmic governance structure.
That's how the divine council worldview reads it, yes. And it's not an isolated idea. The ancient Near Eastern world had parallel concepts. The Ugaritic tablets discovered at Ras Shamra in the 1930s, these are texts from the ancient city of Ugarit, describe a council of gods led by El, which is the same proper name used for God in the Hebrew Bible.
Huh. So the same name.
The same name. And according to Dr. Heiser's research, the Ugaritic texts use phrases like the assembly of El and the sons of El that are conceptually and linguistically parallel to what we find in the Hebrew Bible. Psalm 82:1, for instance, uses the exact same expression for the council that appears in those Ugaritic texts.
Okay, I want to get into Psalm 82 because that one is wild. What's actually happening in that psalm?
So, Psalm 82 is essentially a divine courtroom scene. God stands in the divine assembly and puts the other divine beings on trial. The charge is that they've been judging unjustly and showing partiality to the wicked. They've failed at their job of administering justice among the nations they were assigned to govern.
So they were supposed to be running things well and they dropped the ball.
Exactly. And the verdict is severe. The ESV renders it, "You are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince." God is stripping them of their immortality as punishment. It's a demotion, a cosmic firing, essentially.
That reframes the whole psalm. Most people read that as a metaphor or something about human judges.
And that's a legitimate reading that has a long history. But in the divine council framework, the gods being judged are the same divine beings from Deuteronomy 32, the ones assigned to the nations. And the word used for them, Elohim, is the same Hebrew word used for God himself. It's a functional term, not a statement of equality.
So Elohim just means what? A being that inhabits the spiritual realm?
That's essentially how Heiser defines it. It's a category of being, not a statement of ontological equality with Yahweh. And that's actually where the scholarly pushback gets interesting. Heath Henning, who published a book-length critique called The Unbiblical Realm in 2023, argues that Heiser's framework veers into polytheism by recognizing multiple deities, and that Philo of Alexandria, a first-century Jewish writer, would have called this view polytheistic.
So this isn't a settled debate. There are serious scholars on both sides.
Very much so. Henning's critique, published through the Theopolis Institute, argues that Heiser's use of Ugaritic and other ancient Near Eastern sources to interpret the Bible reflects a kind of syncretism, blending pagan frameworks with biblical theology. And he points out that the Bible itself explicitly warns Israel against inquiring into the religions of surrounding nations.
That's a real tension. Like, you're using pagan texts to interpret a text that tells you not to look at pagan texts.
Henning makes exactly that point. He notes that Heiser himself concedes that what comes out of the mouth of pagans cannot constitute a sound source of Israelite theology, and yet Heiser's methodology depends on those sources. So the debate is genuinely live. But what's notable is that even Henning acknowledges that the idea of an angelic council has historical precedent within Judaism and Christianity. The disagreement is about how far to take it and how to frame it.
Okay, so even the critic isn't saying there's no such thing as angelic beings involved in the governance of nations, just that Heiser's specific framework goes too far.
That's a fair summary. And that brings us to Daniel 10, which is probably the most vivid and concrete passage on this whole topic, and it's hard to read it as purely metaphorical.
What happens in Daniel 10?
So Daniel has a vision, and an angelic messenger comes to him and explains that he was delayed for 21 days because the prince of Persia was opposing him. Then Michael, described as one of the chief princes, came to help him break through. And later in the vision, the messenger says the prince of Greece is coming next.
So the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece aren't human rulers.
Right. In the divine council framework, these are interpreted as spiritual entities, fallen divine beings associated with those nations. And Michael is explicitly called your prince in relation to Israel, which maps directly onto the Deuteronomy 32 structure. Each nation has a spiritual overseer, and they are in active conflict with each other.
So the geopolitical conflicts we see on Earth are, at least in part, reflections of something happening in a spiritual dimension above them.
That's exactly how a doctoral candidate in theology and psychology named Jeff Barletier framed it in a 2025 piece. He wrote, "What if the wars we see on Earth aren't just fought by armies, but also by unseen forces? What if every nation, every ruler, and every border is influenced by beings we cannot see, yet whose actions shape history?" And he argues that this idea appears not just in the Bible, but in ancient Greek philosophy as well.
Wait, Greek philosophy? Like, this isn't just a biblical thing?
This is where it gets genuinely fascinating. In Book 7 of Plato's Laws, daemons, these are moral intermediaries, serve as go-betweens connecting gods and humans, guiding the movements of stars and influencing human behavior. Barletier draws a parallel between Plato's daemons and the biblical framework, arguing that both describe a hierarchy where higher beings regulate the universe and maintain order.
So there's this shared intuition across cultures that humans aren't the top of the cosmic chain of authority.
And Philo of Alexandria, a first-century Jewish philosopher, actually integrates Greek cosmology with Jewish theology in a similar way. He interprets Deuteronomy 4:19, which warns Israel not to worship celestial bodies, as a reminder that these intermediary beings have real authority but are never to be worshipped. They execute divine governance, they don't replace it.
That's a really important distinction. Authority without worship. They're administrators, not gods.
Exactly. And that distinction carries into the New Testament in a really significant way. Paul in Colossians 1:16 writes, "For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him." That list, thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities, is understood by biblical scholars as referring to different ranks and orders within the spiritual realm.
So Paul is basically acknowledging the whole hierarchy exists and then saying Christ is above all of it.
That's the move. And then Ephesians 6:12 makes it even more explicit. "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this world's darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." Paul isn't speaking metaphorically here. He's describing a structured spiritual opposition with ranks.
So the New Testament doesn't abandon the divine council framework, it reframes it through the lens of Christ's supremacy.
Right. Ephesians 1:20-21 says Christ was raised and seated far above all rule and authority, power and dominion, and every name that is named, not only in the present age but also in the one to come. The hierarchy is real, but Christ sits above the entire structure.
And 1 Peter 3:22 says something similar, right? Angels, authorities, and powers subject to him.
Exactly. So the New Testament writers are not dismantling the idea of a spiritual hierarchy. They're asserting that Jesus has been exalted above every level of it, which actually makes the crucifixion and resurrection even more cosmically significant than just a human salvation story.
That's a genuinely different way to read those passages. Like, the stakes are bigger than I think most people realize when they read Ephesians.
And that's really Heiser's central argument in The Unseen Realm, that recovering this supernatural worldview makes the Bible make more sense, not less. Questions like, why wasn't Eve surprised when the serpent spoke to her? Or, why does Paul describe evil spirits in terms of geographical rulership? These become answerable when you understand the framework the authors were writing within.
Darrell Bock from Dallas Theological Seminary said something about the book that stuck with me. He said, "There is a world referred to in the scripture that is quite unseen but also quite present and active." That's a striking endorsement from a mainstream evangelical scholar.
And John Goldengay from Fuller Theological Seminary said, "How was it possible that I had never seen that before?" Which tells you something. These aren't fringe voices. These are serious Old Testament scholars saying this framework illuminates things they'd missed.
So let me push on the angelic hierarchy piece a bit more, because I think people have a very flat picture of angels, like they're all basically the same kind of being with wings. But the search results suggest something much more structured.
Yeah, the tradition of a structured angelic hierarchy goes back at least to a 5th century work called De Coelesti Hierarchia, attributed to Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, which divided the angelic host into 3 hierarchies, each containing 3 orders, giving 9 ranks total. Thomas Aquinas later engaged with this framework extensively in his Summa Theologica.
9 ranks. That's a lot more organized than the Sunday school version.
Right. And at the top are the seraphim, described as the closest to the throne of God, almost always associated with fire. Isaiah 6 describes them with 6 wings. Then cherubim, who are described as next in power, and notably, they're the first angels actually mentioned in the Bible, posted outside the Garden of Eden after the expulsion of Adam and Eve.
So the cherubs on Valentine's Day cards are not really accurate.
Not even close. The cherubim in the tradition are described as having the bodies of a winged bull, eagle, or sphinx, with the faces of lions or men. They're described as maintaining the records of heaven and overseeing the lower ranks of the heavenly host. These are not cute baby angels.
That's a genuinely terrifying image. And it makes the biblical descriptions of people falling on their faces when they encounter angels make a lot more sense.
Exactly. And the biblical doctrine of angels from a theological standpoint, as outlined in study notes from Bridge Bible Fellowship, describes angels as intelligent, rational, communicative spirit beings capable of moral reasoning and choice. They're not mindless messengers. They have agency, which is why the fallen ones can rebel and why the ones in Psalm 82 can be held accountable for injustice.
Which brings us back to Psalm 82 in a new way. If these beings have genuine moral agency, then the judgment scene in that psalm isn't just symbolic, it's a real reckoning.
That's the reading. And it raises a question that I think is worth sitting with. If the nations were assigned to divine beings who then failed at their mandate, what does that mean for how we understand history? The corruption, the injustice, the cycles of oppression that have marked human civilization. Is there a spiritual dimension to that failure?
That's a heavy question. And I don't think there's a clean answer.
There isn't. But the framework at least gives you a way to think about it that doesn't reduce everything to purely human causes. The Bible is presenting a cosmos where spiritual and earthly realities are deeply intertwined, and where the decisions of beings in the unseen realm have real consequences for people on the ground.
And the Michael piece in Daniel 12 is interesting here too, because he's described as the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. That's active, present tense intervention.
Right. The phrase stand up in Daniel 12:1 is interpreted as signifying decisive, active intervention on behalf of God's people during a period of unprecedented trouble. So Michael isn't a passive guardian, he's a combatant. And the fact that in Daniel 10 he's described as coming to help the angelic messenger break through the opposition of the prince of Persia, that's a picture of active spiritual warfare over nations.
So the question, do nations have guardian angels? The biblical answer seems to be something like yes, but it's more complicated and more contested than the comfortable version of that idea.
That's well put. The Bible with Life editorial team, in a piece reviewed for biblical accuracy, put it this way: while the Bible is silent on the concept of a guardian angel for every nation in a neat, tidy sense, it does provide powerful clues about a reality of spiritual warfare where high-ranking angels and demonic entities are directly involved in the affairs of earthly kingdoms, and God's ultimate sovereignty remains supreme over all of it.
That last part matters. The framework isn't saying these beings are out of control or that God has lost the plot. It's saying there's a structure and God is at the top of it.
And that's actually what makes the New Testament passages so significant. When Paul says in Ephesians 1 that Christ is seated far above all rule and authority, power and dominion, he's not introducing a new idea. He's saying the one who created and presides over the entire divine council has now, through the resurrection, been exalted in a way that settles the question of ultimate authority once and for all.
So the cosmic conflict that runs from Genesis through the prophets, it has a resolution point.
That's how Heiser frames it in The Unseen Realm. He describes the ongoing struggle between God and rebellious spiritual entities as a central theme that runs throughout Scripture, from Genesis to the New Testament, and argues that understanding this framework is essential for making sense of difficult or obscure biblical texts. The book sold over 175,000 copies precisely because it gave people a coherent way to read the whole story.
And the expanded edition coming out in October 2025, that's a 10th anniversary edition with new content from Heiser that was never before available in print. So even after his death in 2023, the conversation is continuing.
Which tells you something about how much traction this framework has gotten. And the debate it sparked, with Henning's critique and the Theopolis Institute discussion, is actually healthy. These are the kinds of questions that sharpen theological thinking. Is this polytheism? Is it syncretism? Or is it recovering something the church lost when it stopped reading the Bible in its ancient context?
And that question, whether we've lost something, feels like the real provocation underneath all of this.
It is, because if the original audience of the Bible understood angels over nations as basic background knowledge, the kind of thing you'd ask your grandparents about, then somewhere along the way that knowledge got filtered out. And the question is whether recovering it opens up the text or distorts it.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, the divine council, Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 82, Daniel 10, the New Testament reframing, what does this actually change for someone reading their Bible?
I think it changes the scale of what you're reading. The Bible stops being a collection of moral lessons and personal devotional material and becomes something more like a cosmic drama, with real stakes, real conflict, and real beings operating in a realm you can't see. The wars, the empires, the rise and fall of nations, all of it is happening against a backdrop of spiritual governance that the biblical authors assumed you understood.
And the accountability piece from Psalm 82, God judging the divine beings for failing to administer justice, that's actually a really striking statement about what justice is supposed to look like at every level of reality.
Right. Justice isn't just a human political concern in the biblical framework, it's a cosmic mandate. And when it fails, at the divine level or the human level, there are consequences. The beings in Psalm 82 are told they will die like men. That's not a small thing.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. Whether you land fully in Heiser's camp or you're more cautious like Henning, the text itself is presenting a world that is far more populated and far more structured than most modern readers assume. The unseen realm isn't a metaphor, it's a framework the biblical authors built their entire narrative around.
And the practical implication of that is significant. If Ephesians 6:12 is right, that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, authorities, and spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms, then understanding the structure of that realm isn't just academic. It changes how you interpret conflict, how you pray, and how you understand the world you're actually living in.
That's the part that I think lands hardest. We started with the idea of a hidden government running behind every nation, and by the end of this conversation, that's not a metaphor anymore. It's a serious biblical claim with a long scholarly tradition behind it, a live debate around it, and real implications for how you read everything from Genesis to Revelation.
And the fact that the unseen realm needed a 10th anniversary expanded edition, that it's still generating this much conversation, suggests that people are hungry for a reading of scripture that takes the whole thing seriously, including the parts that are strange and uncomfortable and don't fit neatly into a modern worldview.
If it's weird, it's important. That might be the most honest tagline in biblical scholarship.
And the weirdest parts, the divine council, the sons of God, the prince of Persia blocking an angel for 3 weeks, those are the parts that, once you understand the framework, suddenly make the whole story click into place.
That's a genuinely satisfying place to land. And with that, thanks for being here on Copilot Podcasts. The next time you read Psalm 82 or Ephesians 6 or Daniel 10, you won't just be reading ancient poetry. You'll be reading a map of a reality that the biblical authors believed was operating right behind everything you can see. That's worth sitting with.